The chip was in her hand before she understood why she'd reached for it. Marin Callister heard the order a second time, "Archive Keeper Callister, step away from the console," and still her fingers would not open. The memory chip sat in the bowl of her palm, smaller than a coin, warm from the slot it had just been pulled from. Its adhesive label was half-curled at the corner, and on that label, in blue ink that had faded to the color of a winter sky, someone had written a date. 11/02/2438. That was all. 6 digits, 2 dots, blue ink on a peel corner label no wider than her thumbnail. She knew whose handwriting it was. The Droshari adjudicator across the counter did not know. He saw a chip, a label, and a human refusing a lawful directive inside the daylight archive of Selvin Reach, and his secondary lids were already sliding sideways in the gesture that meant his patience had a timestamp on it. I will tell you what happened next, but first you need to understand what had already happened. What brought a 31-year-old human archivist to the brightest hall on a plateau 12 light-years from Earth, holding a dead woman's handwriting and deciding, in the space of a heartbeat, that the date mattered more than the directive? 8 months earlier, Marin had arrived on Selvin Reach as part of a cultural exchange residency. The Droshari Continuity Bureau maintained the Daylight Archive, a vast lattice of crystal shelving and daylit corridors stretching across half a plateau, each corridor numbered and lit from above by engineered panels that mimicked planetary noon regardless of the hour. The light never changed. That was deliberate. The Droshari believed that memory should exist only in brightness. That shadow was the first stage of forgetting, and the archive's function was to prevent precisely that. Inside those corridors, the indexed memory of 11 species occupied crystal racks from floor to ceiling. Every record that passed through the Bureau was classified, cross-referenced, and assigned a permanence rating on a binary scale. Temporary, to be erased on schedule. Permanent, to be etched into the lattice. There was no middle ground, no conditional category, no maybe. The Droshari had a phrase for the space between classifications, Venthal, which translated roughly as the place that does not exist. Records that fell into Venthal were anomalies. Anomalies were resolved by erasure because in the Droshari system, a thing that could not be classified could not be preserved. Classification was existence. Without it, a record was nothing. The Bureau had requested a human specialist because humans cataloged differently. Their binary had begun to fracture under the weight of records that refused to sit cleanly on either side, ambiguous provenance, untranslatable annotation, emotional metadata that the lattice could not parse, recordings whose value depended on who had made them rather than what they contained. The Bureau's solution was characteristically Droshari: identify the deficiency, acquire a specialist from the species that reportedly practiced something called context, integrate the concept, and resolve the anomalies. They expected the process to take 6 months. They did not expect the process to require grief. Marin's supervisor was a senior archivist named Thesivon. He was precise, unhurried, and approximately 7 feet of gray-blue cartilage with 4 arms that moved independently, 2 for the lattice and 2 for the console. He spoke Terran Standard with the cadence of someone reading a manual aloud and finding it adequate. He never raised his voice. He never lowered it. In 8 months, Marin had never heard him express an opinion that was not a classification. She had, however, watched him reshelve a Seleshi musical archive with a care that bordered on tenderness, his lower arms cradling each chip as though it were something more fragile than crystal, and she had understood that his precision was not coldness. It was devotion expressed in the only language he trusted: accuracy. Her partner on the human side was Kate Duval. Kate was 53, ex-University of Cascadia Library Sciences. She had crow's feet around her eyes from years of squinting at archival screens in poor lighting on colony stations, where the budgets ran thin and the humidity ran high. She had short gray hair she cut herself, badly, every 6 weeks with a pair of scissors she kept in her toolkit next to the labeling tape. She wore bureau-issue coveralls with the sleeves rolled to her forearms because, she said, you cannot feel a chip through a sleeve, and feeling was the point. She touched things. That was the defining characteristic, the quality that made Kate unlike any other archivist Marin had worked alongside. In a profession that had moved almost entirely to remote handling, lattice interfaces, haptic gloves, drone-guided retrieval, Kate picked up chips with her bare hands and held them to the light. She pressed her thumb against crystal faces to gauge the etch depth. She peeled back labels to see if anything had been written underneath. She ran her fingertip along shelf edges to check for dust, because dust meant inactivity, and inactivity meant neglect. And she wrote dates on everything. She kept a roll of small adhesive labels in her toolkit and a ballpoint pen in her breast pocket, blue ink, cracked cap, brought from Earth. The pen was cheap, the kind sold in packs of 12 at a supply counter. The ink was the standard blue that had not changed formulation in 2 centuries. But the habit was priceless. Every label Kate wrote was an act of custody, a small paper flag pressed to an object's surface that said, someone held this thing on this specific day and decided it was worth placing in time. A thing without a date is a thing without a body, Kate told Marin during their second week. They had been sitting in corridor 4 East, cataloging a batch of Celestia navigational music on chips so old the crystal had begun to haze. Several had no metadata, no origin, no date, no author. They existed in the lattice the way ghosts exist in a house, present but uncounted. Kate peeled a label from her roll, wrote the current date in blue ink, neat, small, left-leaning digits that Marin would have recognized across a room, and pressed it to the chip's casing with her thumb. There. Now it has a body. Now it was here on this day. It was such a small thing, a label, a date, a ballpoint pen, and Kate said it with such matter-of-fact conviction that the statement carried no drama. It was not a philosophy. It was a description of what she was doing, the way a carpenter describes planing with the grain. Marin watched her do it 200 times after that. Every undated chip got a label. Every label got a date. Every date was written in the same blue ink, the same small left-leaning hand, and everyone said, Kate Duval held this. It is real. I was here. There was an afternoon, Marin remembered it clearly, though she could not remember the exact date, which Kate would have found unacceptable, when they had been cataloging a section of Varangi mineral surveys. The chips were dull work, rows of geological data from a species that had been absorbed into the Droshari administrative framework 3 centuries ago. Most of the surveys had been superseded by newer data. By any reasonable classification, they were temporary candidates for scheduled erasure. But when Kate pulled one from the shelf, she held it to the light and turned it slowly, watching the way the crystal caught the noon panel's glow, and she said, somebody stood on a planet and dug a hole and measured what they found. Somebody decided the minerals in that hole were worth recording. That is not nothing, Marin. She wrote the date, she shelved the chip, she moved to the next. That was Kate. She did not argue for the significance of records. She argued for the significance of the act of recording, of the hand on the thing, the pen on the label, the human decision to stop and say, this matters. This happened. On this day. I should tell you about Kate's toolkit, because it becomes relevant later, and because the details of a dead person's working kit are the kind of thing an archive should preserve. The toolkit was a canvas roll, the color of wet sand, held shut by a single brass snap that Kate had replaced twice because she opened and closed it 30 times a shift. Inside, the label roll, white adhesive paper, 50 labels per roll. She went through one every 2 weeks. A pair of fine-point tweezers for lifting labels that had been placed by someone else. The scissors. A magnification loupe she rarely used because she trusted her fingers more than her eyes. A small flat brush for dust, bristles stiff enough to clean crystal faces without scratching. And the pen. The pen sat in a cloth loop sewn into the roll's interior, positioned so that when the roll was open, The pen was the first thing you reached. Kate had told Marin once that this was deliberate. The pen should be the first tool in your hand, before the tweezers, before the brush, because the first thing you do with a record is mark the day you touched it. Everything else comes after. The pen is the beginning. After Kate died, the toolkit was cataloged as personal effects by the Bureau and held in a storage drawer in the administrative wing. Marin requested it. The request was processed through 3 levels of Droshari bureaucracy. Personal effects of deceased non-bureau personnel required a chain of custody waiver, a next of kin confirmation, Kate's sister on Earth, who signed the waiver by remote, and a content inventory verified by 2 archivists. It took 6 weeks. When Marin finally held the canvas roll, she opened it and the brass snap made its familiar sound, and the labels were still inside. 11 unused labels on the half-spent roll, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, the adhesive still viable. She did not use them, she kept them in the roll. She kept the roll in her bunk and later in her quarters on Earth and later in the drawer beside her bed. Not as a shrine, as a fact. The labels existed. The pen was separate in her pocket in use. The roll was the rest of the kit and the rest of the kit was complete and it did not need to be used to matter. 11-02-2438 was the date Kate cataloged the chip Marin was now holding. A Varangi mineral survey, routine, flagged as ambiguous because the survey team had dissolved before filing final provenance. Kate wrote the date, pressed the label, shelved the chip in slot 7 South 1142. 9 days later she was dead. Pulmonary embolism, mid-shift, corridor 7 South. She had been running a provenance query on a batch of undated Seleshi fragments. She slumped sideways in her chair. The pen was in her pocket. The query was still scrolling. The engineered daylight fell on her face the same way it fell on everything in the archive, constant, bright, completely without mercy. Marin reached her in 40 seconds, running through corridors with her boots striking crystal composite and her breath tearing in her chest. She reached Kate and knew, the way the body knows before the mind confirms, that reaching was not going to be enough. The Droshari medical team arrived 90 seconds later. Vascular obstruction, non-survivable, no external cause. The human body hides its killing blows in the smallest vessels, a clot the size of a pea, and 53 years of library science ended in a numbered corridor. They returned the pen in a clear evidence sleeve, sealed and tagged per bureau regulation as though the pen were a record and the death were its provenance chain. Marin took it out of the sleeve that evening. She held it. She uncapped it. She looked at the ballpoint tip, smeared faintly with blue. She capped it. She put it in her breast pocket. She did not use it. The Bureau processed the death the way it processed everything. Kate's active queries were reassigned. Her workstation was logged as available. Her personnel file was closed with a notation. Specialist Duval, C. Residency terminated by medical event, Corridor 7 South, 20-02-2438. Duration of service, 5 months, 12 days. Classification of contribution, satisfactory. Satisfactory. Marin read the word on the administrative notification and pressed her thumb against it hard enough to leave a print on the screen. 5 months and 12 days of labeling every chip she touched, of arguing with the lattice about things the lattice could not feel, of teaching Marin that an archive was not a building full of data, but a building full of evidence that people had existed, and the Bureau's summation was satisfactory. She did not file a complaint. There was no category for it. What would she write? The classification does not adequately capture the value of the classified. That was the problem with the whole system, and it was not a problem a complaint form could hold. 4 months passed. Marin grieved the way humans grieve, unevenly, privately, on a schedule visible to no one. Some mornings the loss was a low hum she could work over. Other mornings it was a roar and she sat on the edge of her bunk for 20 minutes looking at the wall and breathing, because breathing was the only task she could complete. She cried in the lavatory in Corridor 3 East, the one with the frosted panel that let the daylight pour in from above, so she cried in brightness. It felt wrong and also accurate. Grief does not need shadow. Loss finds you in the brightest rooms. Thesavan noticed, though he never said so directly. He adjusted her schedule, fewer early morning shifts, which were the hardest, because the archive at 600 was the archive at its quietest, and the quiet was where the grief lived. He reassigned the Seleshi navigational music cohort to another team, because those were the chips Kate had been cataloging when she died, and he understood, in the precise, categorical way the Droshari understand things, that proximity to the last task a person performed is not the same as proximity to the person, but the body does not always know the difference. He never mentioned Kate by name. He never offered condolences. But the schedule adjustments were there, noted in the system log, and when Marin pulled up the change history, she saw his authorization code beside each one and understood that accuracy was his language of care. She continued the work. She ran Kate's queries. She reviewed the ambiguous record cohort, and she found Kate's handwriting, dozens of labels, dozens of dates in blue ink scattered through the corridors like small monuments. Every time she found one, the loss hit again. A door swinging open onto a room where Kate was alive, where the pen was in Kate's pocket, where the labels were being written by the right hands. She found one in Corridor 9 North, on a chip containing Theshari atmospheric readings from a planet that no longer existed, swallowed by its own star 2 centuries ago. The planet was gone. The star was a white dwarf. The atmospheric data was useless, but Kate had written the date, 28092437. She had held the chip, read the data, and judged it worth placing in time, even though the place the data described had ceased to exist. That was the thing about Kate. She did not evaluate whether the object merited custody. She simply provided it, the hand on the thing, the date. Marin shelved the chip back in its slot. She did not remove the label. She could not. Each label was a body, and removing a body from the archive was erasure. And erasure was the thing the Bureau did to records that did not matter. The Bureau did not ask her to remove them. For 4 months, the labels occupied Venthal, unrecognized, invisible, present but uncounted, until someone filed a reclassification request. Marin never learned who. The Droshari bureaucracy was meticulous about process and opaque about persons. The request existed as a document without a face, and the Bureau processed it the way it processed everything, thoroughly, impersonally, on schedule. I should tell you about the morning of the directive, about what the frame narrator knows and what was reported afterward, because the two versions do not perfectly agree, and the disagreement is part of the record. All Marin knew was that on this morning, a directive executor named Corvus had arrived at 7:40 with a formal erasure manifest and 2 lattice technicians, and he had informed her that 412 items did not meet permanence criteria. He said it without cruelty, without apology, without awareness that the fact had a blade in it. Most of those chips carried Kate's labels. Most had dates in blue ink. They would be erased by end of shift. Marin had nodded. She had pulled up the manifest. She had begun deshelving. She was calm, professional, carrying the hollow ache the way she had carried it for months. Structural, load-bearing, a missing wall in a house she still lived in. And then she reached slot 7 South 1142. The label pressed against her palm. 1102248. Kate's handwriting. The 4 with its horizontal stroke angled slightly upward, as though the number was trying to lift off. Her body decided before her mind could frame a reason. She pulled the chip and held it. Corvus walked over, first directive, second, third, Marin's quiet no filling the corridor. We are back at the counter. The manifest is signed, Corvus said. The item does not meet permanence criteria. Human annotation does not constitute provenance under Bureau Code 1144. I know what the code says. then compliance is not discretionary. Neither is this. She turned the chip. The label caught the daylight. The blue ink was almost silver, but the date was legible, and the handwriting was Kate's, and the curl of the 4 was Kate's, and there was no way to erase the label without erasing those things. This label is not annotation, it is a date. Dates are annotation. Dates are provenance. A date tells you when this chip was held by a person who decided it was real. That information does not exist anywhere else in your lattice, not in your classification trees, not in your origin chain documentation. It exists here. She pressed her index finger against the label. In ink. On paper, written by a hand that is no longer alive. Corvus's upper arms unfolded slowly. The Bureau defines provenance as origin chain documentation verified by 2 or more independent lattice-registered sources. A handwritten human date on an adhesive label does not meet that threshold. Then your threshold is wrong. No adrenaline, no bravado, just the mechanical fact. The threshold was wrong. The Droshari binary had no room for what Kate understood, that a record's value was not in its classification but in the act of someone stopping long enough to write a date. To say I was here, I saw this, on this day. Corvus tilted his head, the Droshari gesture of recalibrating a failed category. Explain. Marin set the chip on the counter. Her finger stayed on the label. The woman who wrote this died 4 months ago. Her name was Kate Duval. She cataloged this chip on the day the date says. She held it in her bare hands and decided it was worth placing in time. Then she wrote the date in ink, from a pen she brought from Earth, because she believed that a thing without a date is a thing without a body. Her throat closed briefly, the body remembering what the mind had been managing. Your code says this is annotation. Your code says annotation is removed during deprovenance. But this label is the last physical proof that a specific person touched a specific object on a specific day. If you erase it, you are not deprovenancing a record. You are erasing the fact that she was here. The corridor held, the daylight did not change. But Corvus's posture shifted, arms loosening, secondary lids sliding halfway shut. The Droshari equivalent of turning off the official record and looking with personal eyes. Bureau Code 1144 does not recognize handwritten dates as provenance, he said, slower now, not reading from the manual. I know. If I leave this label intact, the manifest will show an incomplete erasure. I will be required to file a deviation report. Then file it. The deviation report will require a justification category. There is no category for a human colleague's handwriting. Then create one. Corvus was still. The technicians watched with the stillness of people witnessing something they had no protocol for. Then he reached across the counter with his lower left arm, the personal arm, the one the Droshari reserved for gestures that were not official, and touched the edge of the label. Not the chip, the paper, the ink. His fingertip rested on the date for 3 seconds. The Droshari processed tactile information faster than humans. 3 seconds of touch was closer to 10 seconds of looking. He was reading the date the way Kate had written it, through contact. 11022438, he said. Each digit separate, pronounced the way the Droshari speak coordinates, each number in its own location in space. Yes. And the person who wrote this is no longer alive. No. He withdrew his hand, straightened, 4 arms to regulation rest, secondary lids retracted back on the record. I am entering a deviation code. Category, provenance by attestation. Subcategory, tactile human origin mark. Justification, the annotation constitutes a datable, individuated material proof of custodial contact that is not replicated elsewhere in the lattice. Regulatory prose, but Marin heard what was underneath. A Droshari inventing a category that had never existed in daylight on the record, because a piece of paper with a date on it had touched him in a place the manual did not cover. The item in slot 7 South 1142 is reclassified to permanent. The label is retained. Marin exhaled, small. She had not known she was holding her breath. And the other 411. Corvus looked at her, not at the console. How many carry this same annotation? The blue ink, the handwritten date. 207. His head tilted, recalibrating. Pull them, I will apply the deviation code to each one. The remainder proceed to erasure as scheduled. It was not everything. 205 records would still be erased, records Kate never touched, records with no ink, no body. You cannot save everything. You cannot even save most things. What you can save is the proof that someone tried. She nodded. I need a crew to reshelve. Use mine. The technician stepped forward, tools already unclipped. The taller one, iridescent skin of a coastal genotype, glanced at the label and looked away with deliberate care. Not avoidance. Respect. The reshelving took the rest of the day. Pull the chip, check the label. Confirm the blue ink, Kate's shade unmistakable. Log the slot. Set the chip in the permanent tray. Move to the next. The technicians matched the rhythm within an hour. They held labeled chips by the edges, avoiding the ink. At 9:40, Marin found slot 7 South 204. The label was upside down, the date written vertically, digits running bottom to top. 2709247. A small rebellion, the kind Kate would have made during a long afternoon when the corridors were empty. Marin could see her doing it, rotating the pen, writing upward, because the rules said where to put the label but not which way to write the numbers. At 10:40, Corvus showed her the deviation code on his console. The subcategory field, tactile human origin mark, single source, non-replicable deceased custodian. The justification narrative, a single line translated by the console. Material evidence of individual contact supersedes binary classification in cases where the attester is no longer available for verification. The most Droshari way to say, the person who wrote this is dead, and you cannot erase the last thing her hands made. At 11:50, the shorter technician paused at a chip whose label had partially detached. Adhesive dried, the label hanging by one corner. Without speaking, he pulled archive-grade adhesive from his toolkit, pressed the label flat, smoothed it with his fingertip, held the chip to the light to confirm the date was readable. Then he set it in the permanent tray. Marin watched and felt something shift in her chest, not the grief but something beside it. The technician had not been instructed to repair the label. He had watched Marin pull chips because the ink mattered and concluded that the label holding the ink also mattered, and if the label was failing, it should be repaired. He repaired 4 more that afternoon. Each time, the thing beside the grief grew. At 12:15, they reached a section of Corridor 7 South where Kate had worked alone. Marin knew this because the labeling pattern changed, slightly wider spacing between the adhesive edge and the chip's dataface, and the dates written in a looser hand, the way Kate's handwriting relaxed when she was not being watched. There were 18 chips in a row, all labeled in that loose hand, and the date spanned 6 days in early October 2437. 6 days of Kate sitting alone in a corridor of daylight, cataloging records no one else had touched in decades, writing dates on things the Bureau had forgotten it owned. Marin pulled each one, checked the ink, logged the slot. The loose handwriting felt more intimate than the careful version closer to the person, further from the professional. She wondered whether Kate had talked to herself during those shifts, the way archivists do when the corridors are empty and the silence is the specific kind that forms between crystal walls. She would never know. That was the hardest part of the dead, not the absence but the unanswerable questions. Did she hum? Did she stretch her shoulders at 1400 the way she did when Marin was watching? Did she eat the protein bar at her station or walk to the common area? The labels could not answer. They were dates, not diaries, but they were enough. They were bodies. At 1310, Marin found a chip with 2 labels. The first was Kate's, 14082437. The second was a strip of Droshari formal script, cross-reference to Varangi Geological Survey, origin chain incomplete, retained pending human context review. An unnamed Droshari archivist had seen Kate's label and responded, not by flagging it for removal but by building from it, treating the handwritten date as a starting point. The chip had been in Venthal. Kate's label gave it a body. The unnamed archivist gave it a reason to stay. At 1350, Corvus returned from his console and told Marin that 2 additional directive executors had contacted him regarding the deviation code. They had seen it in the Bureau's active manifest feed. They wanted to know if it was an error. He told them it was not. One of them, an adjudicator named Selin, who managed the archive's East Wing, asked Corvus to forward her the code's justification narrative. She had, she said, 23 items in her own manifest that carried handwritten annotation from a different human specialist, a botanist who had passed through the archive 2 years ago and left dates on 17 chips containing soil survey data from the Kashan reaches. The botanist was still alive. Did the code apply? Corvus looked at Marin. Marin thought about it. The botanist was alive. The custodian could still verify. The code, as written, specified a deceased custodian, but the principle was not about death. The principle was about the hand on the thing. Yes, she said, the code applies. Alive or dead, the hand was there. The date proves it. Corvus amended the deviation code. He removed the word deceased from the subcategory. The new subcategory read, tactile human origin mark, single source, non-replicable. He sent the amendment to Selin. Marin did not learn until much later that Selin applied the code to all 17 of the botanist's labels that afternoon, and that the botanist, a woman named Yasha Tremont, working on a research station in the Kashan system, received a formal notification from the Bureau that her handwritten dates had been classified as Provenance. Tremont, by all accounts, stared at the notification for a long time and then went back to her greenhouse and wrote a date on a pot. At 1405, the shorter technician, whose name Marin learned later was Dreven, asked her a question she had not expected. They were in Corridor 8 East, pulling a chip whose label was so perfectly placed it looked printed. Kate's careful hand. An early label before she had relaxed into the looser script of solo shifts. The woman who wrote these, Dreven said. His voice was lower register, the Droshari equivalent of speaking quietly. Was she aware of the Bureau's classification system when she applied the dates? Marin looked at him. She was. And she chose to apply an unrecognized annotation to items within a recognized system. She did, knowing it would fall into Venthal. Yes. Dreven held the chip at arm's length, studying the label the way one studies a navigational chart, not for what it says but for where it leads. She placed things in Venthal deliberately, in the place that does not exist, because she believed they should exist. Marin had not thought of it that way. Kate had not been defying the system. She had been populating Venthal, filling the uncategorized space with evidence, planting bodies in the place where the Bureau said nothing could live. Not as protest, as practice. She was building a case, Marin said, one label at a time. Dreven set the chip in the permanent tray. He said nothing more. But for the rest of the afternoon, he handled the labeled chips with a care that went beyond procedure. A deliberateness that suggested he was no longer processing a manifest, but participating in an argument that had started before he arrived and would continue after he left. I need to tell you about the erasures, not only the keepings. At 1420, the taller technician finished processing Corridor 8 West. That section held 61 items on the manifest. 9 carried Kate's labels, 52 did not. The 52 were erased on schedule. The lattice technician ran the deprovenance sequence. The crystal faces went blank and the data that had been stored there ceased to exist. It took 4 seconds per chip. A chirp from the console, a brief flicker in the crystal, and then nothing. Not silence, nothing. The difference matters. Silence is the absence of sound. Nothing is the absence of the thing that made the sound worth hearing. Marin did not watch the erasures. She could not. She knew intellectually that the 52 were records without labels, without dates, without the proof that a hand had touched them. They were, by every measure she had just argued, records without bodies, but they were still records. Someone, somewhere, at some point, had created them. The fact that no one had written a date on their surface did not mean they had never been held. It meant the holding had not been documented. This is the part that acceptance requires you to sit with. You cannot save everything. The principal Marin argued that the hand on the thing matters also meant, by painful inversion, that things without a documented hand were harder to save. The 205 erasures were not arbitrary. They were the cost of a binary system encountering a concept it had not been built for, and the cost was paid by the records that fell on the wrong side of the new line. Marin understood this. She did not accept it easily. She accepted it the way you accept that a roof keeps rain off the rooms it covers, and not the ones it does not, as a structural fact that does not stop being unfair. At 14:30, Thessalon appeared at the far end of Corridor 7 South. He stood in the daylight and watched for 11 minutes, 4 arms at rest, expression unreadable. Marin did not look up. When she glanced toward the corridor's end, he was gone. On her console, deviation code registered. THSSIVAN 7, Senior Archivist countersigning. No further action required. He had not overruled. He had not questioned. He had added his name. The way Kate would have added a date quietly in ink that would not wash off. At 15:20, a new problem. The taller technician flagged slot 9 North 17. The chip bore a label in blue ink, Kate's hand, unmistakably, but the date was illegible. The adhesive had partially melted against the crystal face in a warm section of the corridor, and the ink had spread. The digits were shapes without values, blue stains that had once been numbers. Corvus walked over. He studied the label through a magnification lens mounted on his upper right wrist. He turned the chip. He angled it under the daylight panels. "I can read the month," he said. "The 10th month, the day and year are indeterminate. But it is her handwriting." He looked at the label again, at the ink, at the way the letters blurred at the edges. The deviation code requires a datable mark. This mark is partially datable, the month is legible, the remainder is not. He paused. The secondary lids did half slide, the personalized gesture. However, the ink is consistent with the other labels. The placement is consistent. The adhesive type is consistent. The hand is identifiable even where the date is not. He entered a subnotation, partial date attestation, identifiable custodial hand confirmed, month legible, full date inferred by analogy with collocated labels of matching characteristics. Marin stared at the screen. Corvus had just done something no Droshari was trained to do. He had inferred. He had taken incomplete data and filled the gap with context, the very thing the Bureau had hired humans to provide. "That is a human argument," she said. "It is a correct argument," Corvus said. "The origin of a correct argument is irrelevant to its application." And he shelved the chip. At 16:10, Marin found chip 7 South 891. The date was 03/11/2437, blue ink. But beneath the date, in letters so small Marin had to tilt the chip until the angle caught, Kate had written 2 words. "For keeps." She sat on the corridor floor. She looked at those 2 words. For keeps. A librarian's joke, a small quiet inscription on a surface nobody else would read, a declaration of love for the objects in her care. Sitting on the floor of a daylit corridor 12 light-years from Earth, holding the last joke a dead woman had written in blue ink. Marin did not laugh and did not cry. She breathed. She logged the number. She shelved the chip. She pressed her palm against the cool crystal of the shelf for one moment. The composite was smooth, faintly warm from the panels above, and it held her weight the same way it held the records, without opinion, without judgment, simply by being solid. Then she stood and moved on. The grief was still there. It would always be there, not a wound but a room she entered and left and entered again, with no door she could close because it was not a room. It was a missing wall, and the house still stood, and the wind came through, and she had learned to dress for the wind. But the grief was no longer alone. Beside it, 207 dates in blue ink, each one a body, each one kept. A technician who repaired a label without being asked. A senior archivist who countersigned without being consulted. An adjudicator in the East Wing who extended the principle because the principle was right. A botanist in the Cashin system who wrote a date on a pot. The loss had not been erased. 205 records were gone. Those losses were real. But the 207 that remained carried the weight of a specific hand on a specific thing on a specific day, written in ink that faded but did not disappear. That was acceptance, not the theatrical kind. Just this: loss and preservation could share the same space. Grief and keeping were neighbors. Saving what you could was not diminished by what you could not save. It was the work. By 1740, the reshelving was complete. 207 in permanent storage. 205 erased. Manifest closed. Corvus filed his report. Marin signed the acknowledgement. The technicians left. The taller one turned at the corridor entrance and gave Marin a long, steady look acknowledgement, nothing more, and was gone. The corridor was empty. Marin sat at Kate's console. The bureau called it the workstation formerly assigned to Specialist Duval, as though the console were the thing that had been lost. She took out the pen. Cracked cap, cheap ballpoint, blue ink. 4 months in her pocket, unused, because every time she uncapped it she felt the weight of the blank labels, and the understanding that writing a date would mean accepting that the hand that should have been writing was not coming back. But today she had held a date in her palm and told an alien that a thing without a date is a thing without a body. And the alien listened. And the date was kept. And a deviation code was invented for a category the Bureau had never needed, because a human woman said no in daylight. The pen was not a memorial. It was a tool. Using it did not erase the hand that used it before her. It continued the work. She uncapped the pen. She pulled a blank label from the supply drawer. She pressed it to the console and wrote today's date 19062439 in blue ink in her own handwriting that was nothing like Kate's. 4s crossed flat, 2s rounder, 0s wider, but the ink was the same and the act was the same. A hand, a pen, a date, a body. She attached the label to the underside of the input rail, where it would not interfere with operations, but where anyone who reached underneath would feel the raised edge of paper and know. She capped the pen, pocketed it, left the corridor. The daylight stayed. It always stayed. Here is the part I was not there for. Marin finished her residency 3 months later. She trained 2 successors, a human named Pole, quiet and careful, who held chips the way she had learned to hold them, by the edges, ink side visible, and a Droshari junior archivist named Keep Scout, a name that was itself a translation of a Droshari numeral chain, given at birth because his parents worked in the Census Bureau and believed that names should describe a function. Keep Scout had never met Kate. He knew her only through the labels. Marin sat with him in corridor 7 South on his 3rd day and showed him chip 7 South 891 for keeps and watched his secondary lid slide shut and open again slowly. She did not explain the joke. She waited. He looked at the chip. He read the date. He read the 2 words. She was claiming it, he said. She was. The Bureau does not recognize verbal claims on physical media. The Bureau does now. He blinked all 3 sets the full agreement gesture. Good, he said, and then after a silence, I would like to learn this. She taught him, not the procedure, he already knew that better than she did with Adros Hari's native fluency in lattice architecture. She taught him the habit, the label, the pen. She gave him a ballpoint, not Kate's, a new one from the supply drawer, black ink because she could not bring herself to assign the blue, and watched him practice writing dates on blank labels. His handwriting was angular, precise, and unmistakably Adros Hari in its spacing. Each digit occupied exactly the same width. The dates were beautiful in the way architectural plans are beautiful, ordered, intentional, every line placed with full awareness of the line beside it. It was not Kate's hand, it was not Marin's, it was his own, and that was the point. The protocol did not preserve a specific handwriting, it preserved the act of writing. The hand changes, the ink changes, the date changes, the principle does not. Paul learned differently. He did not need the philosophy. He picked up a label, wrote the date, pressed it to the chip, and moved to the next. When Marin asked him why he did not ask why, he looked at her with an expression that was almost impatient. I work in an archive, he said. I date things, that is the job. Marin laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in the archive since Kate died, and the sound echoed off the crystal shelving in a way that surprised her, bright, clean, a sound the daylight panels seemed designed to carry. She thought Kate would have liked Paul. Kate would have said, finally, someone who doesn't need the speech. Marin returned to Earth with lattice samples, a commendation signed by Thesivon and Corvus, and the cracked pen in her pocket. She did not keep it as a memorial. She kept it because it still had ink. The leaving was harder than she expected, not because of what she was going toward Earth, a teaching position at New Geneva, the slow re-entry into gravity and weather, and the specific quality of sunlight that passes through atmosphere instead of engineered panels. It was hard because leaving meant the labels would continue without her. That was the right thing, that was what a protocol was for, to outlast the person who argued for it, but rightness and ease are not the same thing. She packed her kit. She signed the handover documents. She walked through Corridor 7 South one last time, running her hand along the shelf edges the way Kate used to, checking for dust. There was none. Keep's count was thorough. At the port, Thesivon was waiting. He did not say goodbye, the Adros Hari did not have a word for it, because their language was built around permanence, and goodbye implied something was ending. He said, "Your contribution has been registered." "Thank you, Thesivon." He tilted his head. His lower left arm extended the personal arm, and he held out a small crystal chip, unlabeled, blank. "For your collection," he said. She took it, she held it, she understood. A blank chip, no data, no provenance, no classification. A thing in Venthal, a thing without a body. She took out the pen, she wrote the date on a label, she pressed it to the chip. Thesivon watched. Both pairs of eyes, the official set and the personal set that the Adros Hari pretended were the same. "Now it has a body," she said. "It always did," he said. "You were simply the first to document it." That was the closest a Adros Hari senior archivist had ever come to poetry in Marin's presence. She pocketed the chip. She boarded the transport. She used the pen for 23 years. At New Geneva, teaching archival theory, writing dates on syllabi her students thought eccentric, standing at a lectern and telling a room of 20-year-olds that a thing without a date is a thing without a body, and watching some of them lean forward and some of them check their handhelds, and knowing that the ones who leaned forward were the ones who would carry it. At the Terran Archive Service, introducing custodial attestation, a handwritten field on the intake form, slower than digital, requiring the archivist to stop and write and be present with the object. The service resisted for 2 years. Too slow, too analog. Presence was not supposed to be efficient. She waited. She wrote dates. The service adopted the field in the 3rd year. after a junior archivist named Caswell demonstrated that items with custodial attestation were retrieved 41% more accurately than those without, because the handwritten date gave the retrieval algorithm a human-generated confidence anchor. The efficiency argument won. Marin did not care why it won. She cared that it won. At Prasham Station, consulting on classification integration between human and Droz-Hari systems, writing dates on every chip she touched in blue ink even when the ink had faded so pale she pressed harder, and the dates still read. At a symposium on interspecies archival methodology, she gave a paper titled The Body of the Record, Custodial Contact as Provenance. It was a short paper, 12 pages, and it contained one argument, that provenance was not a property of the record but a property of the relationship between the record and the person who held it. The relationship was documented by the mark. The mark was the date was the body. She delivered it to a room of 91 delegates from 14 species, and when she finished, a Droz-Hari delegate in the third row, young, from the Bureau's training cohort, read the abstract and said, "This is the Duval Protocol." And Marin said, "Yes." And the delegate said, "We teach it at the Bureau." And Marin sat with that for a long time after the session ended, in an empty lecture hall, holding the pen, understanding that the thing she had argued for in a corridor had become the thing that was taught in a classroom, and that the distance between those two places was exactly the distance Kate's ink had traveled. A Seleshi musicologist approached her after the session. The Seleshi were a fluid-bodied species whose written script was wave pattern, and this particular musicologist, a specialist in navigational songs, had been working with the Bureau's musical archives for 7 years. She told Marin that 3 years earlier, she had found a chip in Corridor 4 East containing a navigational song from a Seleshi colony that no longer existed. The colony had been evacuated 2 centuries ago, the colonists absorbed into other populations, the song forgotten. But on the chip's surface, in blue ink that had faded almost to gray, someone had written a date, 09/10/2437. "I did not know the woman who wrote it," the musicologist said, "but I knew someone had listened to the song on that day. That was enough. I made a recording." The song had been preserved. The colony's navigational melody, a sequence of tonal instructions for approaching a harbor that no longer existed on a coastline that had been reshaped by geological drift, survived because a human archivist had written a date on a chip, and a Seleshi musicologist had read the date and concluded, someone was here, and what they heard was worth hearing again. Kate had never known about the song. She had labeled the chip and moved to the next. The label did its work after she was gone, which was, Marin understood, exactly what a body was supposed to do. A body persists. A body is evidence. A body outlasts the life that made it. On Selvin Reach, the deviation code did not remain a deviation. Within 2 years, 36 additional cases processed under the same code. By the 3rd year, reclassified from deviation to standard procedure. They called it the Duval Protocol. The Droz-Hari pronunciation, Duval, with a click between syllables that sounded like the snap of a pen cap. Marin was told this in a letter and sat with the detail for a long time. The protocol was simple. Any annotation bearing datable individuated material proof of custodial contact, handwritten date, thumbprint, pressure mark, personal glyph, was classified as provenance by attestation and could not be erased without higher-level review. It added a step. It slowed the binary. It cost 3 additional processing hours per batch. The Bureau accepted. The Droz-Hari did nothing easily, they did things correctly, which was slower. But once they accepted a principle, they applied it absolutely. Written into the lattice code, taught to new archivists, applied, eventually, to 62 species, because the Droz-Hari discovered what Kate knew and Marin argued and Corvus chose to believe. The hand on the thing was part of the thing. Thesavon retired 4 years after Marin left. In his retirement filing, a public document, he listed his primary professional accomplishment as countersigning the Duval deviation, not 31 years of lattice architecture, the countersignature. Corvus became bureau director. 9 years. He never spoke publicly about the morning in Corridor 7 South. But when his personnel file was unsealed after retirement, the entry for that day contained one annotation in his own hand. In the personal notation field, most Dross-Hari left blank. It read, "The human did not argue that the record was valuable. She argued that the act of recording was valuable. This distinction is not present in current Bureau taxonomy. It should be." One line, the Dross-Hari equivalent of blue ink on a peel corner label. And now I will tell you what I know because I was there for it. Marin came back to Selvin Reach once. She was 57, 26 years after the morning in Corridor 7 South. A bureau invitation, a formal review of the Duval Protocol's cross-species implementation, and they wanted the human who had originated the argument. She arrived on a morning transport and walked into the archive for the first time in a quarter century, and the daylight was the same. The noon panels had not aged. The corridors had not aged. The crystal shelving caught the light the way it always had, bright, constant, without mercy and without tenderness. But the labels had multiplied. Not just Kate's blue ink, hundreds of others. Black ink, red ink, green ink. Dross-Hari angular script, Seleshi wave patterns, Varangi pressure marks. Every species that used the archive had adopted some version of the protocol, and the evidence was visible on every shelf she passed. Small adhesive flags, handwritten marks, dated annotations in dozens of hands. The labels did not match. They were not uniform, they were not pretty. Some were placed upside down. Some were written in scripts Marin could not read. Some bore dates in calendar systems she did not recognize. But everyone said the same thing in a different voice. Someone held this thing on a specific day and decided it was worth placing in time. The formal review took 3 days. Marin sat on a panel with 4 bureau officials, 2 Seleshi cultural administrators, and a Varangi geological archivist whose species communicated primarily through pressure marks on stone and who had, Marin was told, tattooed a date on his own forearm using the Duval Protocol's principle. She looked at the tattoo, a Varangi numeral chain pressed into mineral-dense skin, and thought, that is a date, that is a body, on a body. The review concluded that the protocol had increased cross-species classification accuracy by 14%, reduced anomaly resolution time by 21%, and introduced 0 system errors. The efficiency metrics were clean, but the review's final recommendation was not about efficiency. It was a single line, voted unanimously. The Duval Protocol shall be extended to all incoming records regardless of species of origin. Custodial attestation at point of intake is now standard. Marin signed the recommendation as a witness. Her handwriting, not Kate's, on the official document. One more body added to the record. After the formal sessions ended, Keep Scout met her at the entrance to Corridor 7 South. He was taller now. Dross-Hari cartilage continues to grow slowly throughout their adult span, and his angular handwriting on the labels he showed her was as precise as it had been 26 years earlier, every digit occupying exactly the same width. He walked her through the corridor. He showed her the original 207, still in permanent storage, still bearing Kate's blue ink dates. The labels were faded. The adhesive had been replaced twice, archive grade, applied by hand, each time preserving the original ink. The blue had dimmed to the color of distance, but the dates were legible. He showed her chip 7 South 891, for keeps. The ink had not faded on those 2 words, perhaps because Kate had pressed harder, or perhaps because some inks are stubborn about the things they say. Marin held the chip. She held it the way Kate would have held it, bare hands, both palms, turning it slowly in the daylight. "The pen," Keep Scout said, "do you still have it?" She took it out, 26 years, same pen. The cap was held together by a thin ring of clear adhesive she had applied at some point, she could not remember when. The ballpoint was worn smooth. The ink was pale but present. She uncapped it. She did not write anything. She held it over the chip and let the tip hover above the label, close enough that she could feel the faint tug of the ballpoint wanting to touch paper, and then she capped it and pocketed it. "Why did you not write?" Keepscout asked. "The date is already there," Marin said. "Kate wrote it. It does not need a second one." He considered this. 3 sets of eyes blinking in sequence. "You are saying that some records are complete." "I am saying that some records were completed by the first hand that touched them." He nodded, the Droshari chin dip that meant he would think about it for the rest of the week. Marin read Corvus's personnel file annotation at 64, standing in her kitchen on Earth. A junior clerk named Sorvith had sent the excerpt, part of a retrospective the Bureau was compiling on the protocol's first 3 decades. She read it holding the pen in her right hand, coffee in her left. She read it twice. The human did not argue that the record was valuable. She argued that the act of recording was valuable. She uncapped the pen, same pen, 33 years now, cap held by adhesive, ink paler but still blue, and wrote the date on the printout's margin, where anyone holding the page would see it. Blue ink, a date, a body. She capped the pen, pocketed it, finished her coffee. The pen still had ink.